One of the greatest challenges that Catholics face, especially today when the gospel has been rebranded across so many different denominations, is to explain our belief in the Eucharist as truly the body and blood of Christ. Now, among so many reasons to believe in that, not the least of which I've discussed in other reflections on the Eucharist during this Eucharistic series, I believe it's going to end up being 5 parts, is today's gospel, because the gospel, particularly today, is so powerful. Jesus says to the crowds that they must eat his flesh and drink his blood if they want to live. The crowds, on their part, begin to dispute that. Now, the very fact that they're disputing that says they're understanding him in the literal sense, not metaphorically. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be that offensive. Jesus, however, under such pressure to soften his language, buckles down. Amen, amen, I say to you, which is a Jewish expression of underscoring and putting in bold letters whatever is about to follow. And what follows? Unless you eat my flesh. But actually, if you look at the Greek, there's a shift. He now says, unless you gnaw my flesh. And so, in response to their offense, he moves from a very broad word like eat into a very concrete word, gnaw. And then he says, my flesh is real food, my blood real drink. This is not the direction we head in when we're trying to just communicate a metaphor. Instead, he's diving into very intense language. And so the offense of the crowd at Jesus' words and Jesus' shift into stronger language makes very clear to those who are reading the gospel, particularly in the early church, that both the crowds and Jesus take him at his word in the literal sense. And the crowds on their part are repulsed by the idea of what he's saying. Jesus, on his part, is very committed to it. In fact, every verse of the gospel that we heard today references eating Jesus. Every single verse makes an explicit reference to eating him. And out of those 8 verses, the word flesh is used 6 times. So in the face of such bold scriptural evidence, it's very difficult to dismiss the Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. However, it's very easy to miss its significance. Why do I say that? Because the word flesh doesn't just underscore the nature of the Eucharist as Jesus' true body. It points actually to his nuptial identity as bridegroom, and by necessity, therefore, ourselves as the bride. And that's what I want to explain and reflect on with you this afternoon. The word Jesus uses here for flesh in the Greek is sarx. Sarx is the same word that Adam uses the first time he lays eyes on Eve. You probably remember that passage in Genesis which says, and Adam said, now this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, sarx from my sarx. And so the very first bride of all human history is identified as she who is one flesh with her husband. And the next verse really underscores that. The next verse in Genesis explains marriage as when a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined to his wife, and quote, they shall become one flesh. So at the heart of marital union is a union of one flesh between spouses. Therefore, it's significant that God repeats this pattern on Mount Sinai with his people. It's on Mount Sinai that he forges a covenant with his people by sacrificing an animal and then having the animal's blood splashed onto the altar, which is a stand-in for him, and then the blood is splashed on all of the people. The flesh of the animal, as per Jewish law, Part of it would have been consumed on the altar as a burning holocaust, and the other part would have been consumed by the people. And so you have God uniting with his people in one flesh, one blood bond. And from that moment forward, all of the language that God employs to describe his relationship with his people is marital in nature. So he will refer to himself in the prophets as her husband and his people as his bride. When they sin, he accuses them of adultery. And then he frames the day of salvation as a wedding. If you look at Jeremiah 33, the coming of the Messiah is described as a day when the bridegroom and the bride's voices will be heard again. And it will be a day of joy for God's people. This is precisely the reason that Jesus' first miracle is what? It's a wedding where he multiplies the wine. It's also the reason that John the Baptist makes what otherwise would be a very cryptic comment to his disciples when Jesus walks up and he sees him for the first time. What does John the Baptist say? He says, "He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom," meaning himself, "who stands and hears him rejoices with joy because of the voice of the bridegroom," which is what Jeremiah described. Therefore, John the Baptist says, "This joy of mine is now fulfilled." Why? Because the bridegroom is here. And so, when Jesus is saying to all of the people gathered before him that he's offering his flesh to them for the life of the world, he's not just intending this in a redemptive context. It's marital. His words to the crowd today are expressive of his intention to unite with us in a spousal bond. I mean, just sit with that for a minute. What religion do you know of where God so desires his people, he intends to be their bridegroom? St. Augustine says, "Every celebration of the Eucharist is a celebration of marriage, for all the church is Christ's bride, of which the beginning and first fruits is the flesh of Christ. Because there," meaning the Eucharist, "was the bride joined to the bridegroom in the flesh." John Paul II says, "Christ is the bridegroom because he has given himself. His body has been given, his blood has been poured out. In this way, he loved them to the end. The sincere gift contained in the sacrifice of the cross gives definitive prominence to the spousal meaning of God's love. The Eucharist is the sacrament of our redemption. It is the sacrament of the bridegroom and of the bride." Okay, so if we flesh that out, pun intended, when you were baptized, that white garment wasn't just white because of your newfound purity. It's a bridal gown. And everything that happens after your baptism is aimed at raising your bridal identity and dignity into full maturity. This also explains then the exclusive nature of Holy Communion. Just as the marital bed is not open to everybody, hopefully, but just to the spouses, so the Eucharist is reserved only for the bride. And we become the bride at our baptism, and when we profess the fullness of faith in Jesus Christ, and when we live as the bride in the way that Jesus has taught us. Which is why when one of those three parts is missing, the church asks that person to abstain from Holy Communion, because something about their bridal identity is gravely wounded. Until, of course, it is restored either through baptism, profession of the faith, or confession. St. Ambrose refers to the reception of Holy Communion as the kiss of the bridegroom to his bride. But St. John Chrysostom warns that those who receive the Eucharist in a state of grave sin kiss Jesus with the kiss of Judas. And so we stand here now in a very special moment. We are in the position of the Jews in today's gospel passage. We have heard Jesus express his intention not only to give himself to us, to redeem us, but to wed himself to us and to lavish us with divine spousal love. And so we, like them, we have to make a decision whether this is the intimacy that really we desire. So ask yourselves, is this the life you want to live? The commitment that you are prepared to make? The love that you are ready to reciprocate? If so, then like every bride on her wedding day, when you come to this altar, give yourself entirely to him. Forsake everything that keeps you from him, and cleanse your heart for love.